All right. So none of us have anything to disclose. We have to officially tell you that. So my job is to talk about compounding updates as well as take-back rules. You can read the objectives. I won't repeat them for you. But I like to ask questions. Who do you think, just with a show of hands, has the dirtier office, a man or a woman? And I'm a woman, so you're not going to offend me. But anyway, show of hands. Who do you think women have a dirtier office? Who do you think men? I know. I would have said that too, looking at my boys' room. But it is actually women tend to have dirtier offices. And the reason, just with bacterial counts, because of the fact that they wear makeup generally, and bacteria adhere to makeup and lotions. Women tend to have a bigger role with kids, and therefore you get all those little germ vectors. But the reason I tell you this is not to pick on women, but the fact that a lot of our compounding regulations have to do with the things that we think about, like hand washing, no makeup, all those things, protecting facial hair, all those things like we put in our hair. So I put it in there just for you to remember that a lot of the things that we do for compounding have to do with doing all we can to eliminate bacteria. All right, just a quick history of compounding, since that really brings us to where we are today. How many of you, and I'll be in that category too, how many of you graduated in the 70s? How many graduated in the 80s? How many graduated in the 90s? Before that? All right, cool. All right, well, I'm a early 1980s, but those of you that were practicing before that time probably know some of this, that the compounding essentially went away to a large degree because of the introduction of pharmaceutically available product. And the role of USP changed drastically during that time, right? And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Just looking at the 60s and 70s, if you remember, IV admixture services were largely done by nursing. Pharmacy was mostly procurement. And we didn't do a lot of IV manipulations, and there weren't a lot of problems back then. Pharmacy thought they were doing their job and really grew complacent. And I know for a fact, at least in the 80s when I went to school, USP and NF, or the United States USP Pharmacopoeia, it just wasn't even a textbook we even knew about, right? However, what we started to see is contamination. There were a few different bodies that came together to try to address this, at least in terms of addressing standards. And what ASHP essentially found that even though these were out there, nobody was paying a lot of attention to it. Be honest. How many of you can picture yourself? This is what you learned. I know I did, right? That I can picture. I worked at University Hospital when I first came out to Denver, starting in the 1990s, and this is exactly what the IV room, Kathy, who's going out, she worked with me at that time, but this is exactly, I think we still had, I can picture that pharmacist too with that hair. But, I mean, that was probably a TPN solution, remember those big bottles? But that was exactly what we were doing, and can you imagine there's no gloves, there's no mask, none of that we would expect today. Just fast forward a bit, we're starting to see some compounded prescriptions starting to come about. We're starting to see some of the home IV companies as well. But providers started to prescribe other agents and dosage forms that weren't available. And then we started to see this explosion, remember, of all the IV companies that came in the early 1990s, and it was a huge opportunity, all sorts of people, which, that's consolidated a great bit. But what, we live in America and we have the opportunity to make money, and pharmacists saw an opportunity to make money. So we started to see this whole notion of compounding pharmacy. Do any of you work in compounding? I should ask. No? Okay. So compounding pharmacy has become, right, a big deal. A lot of people have made a lot of money with compounding pharmacy. However, we at least didn't do a good job in schools of pharmacy in teaching aseptic technique. And unfortunately, we had a lot of people graduate that really didn't know what to do with a lot of the sterile products. And frankly, that's still something that we run into because of 797, which we'll talk about. We don't have the opportunity to train a lot of our grads in 797, which continues to be a challenge. All right, so USP in 1992 had some draft recommendations. ASHP came forward, but again, nobody was really, these technical bulletins, there wasn't any meat behind them. People didn't have to follow them, so they didn't. So that's remember Angry Birds? I know, I played it. So the FDA, you started to see this battle between the FDA and pharmacy, that the FDA was, none too happy with the practice of pharmacy, and they got Congress to enact the Food and Drug Modernization Act in 97 to address pharmacy compounding and protect patients. However, it went up to the Supreme Court, unfortunately. It was declared unconstitutional, and you've got pharmacy and FDA duking it out, essentially. And unfortunately, there just became this void. But 2008, finally, USP 797. So if you think about it, it hasn't been around all that long. But 797 is really what finally got people's attention and forced people's hand in terms of obeying and having some guidelines for sterile compounding. And our State Board of Pharmacy, that board rules have essentially been based on USP 797 guidelines. Remember, though, that 797 is just the minimum, and it applies to pre-administration manipulation, so not post-administration, but all the things that we need to worry about, compounding, transportation, and storage. It applies to everyone, even though we think of it as pharmacy. It really does apply to all compounding. But just quickly, it does include specific guidelines for things like design, engineering controls, environmental testing. It does force people to do testing. It does require personnel training and testing. That's where we get into trouble with our students because of all the hospitals that we send them to have their own 797 programs, and unfortunately with our students that becomes a challenge to get them trained. Quality assurance testing, adverse event reporting, and storage and dating. All of those are components of 797. Also, remember that the main point is that the direct contact is the principal source of contamination. You can use alternative technologies only if you prove it, though, that it's superior to what 797 requires. So remember, probably a key point, 797 is the minimum. You can employ other technologies if you can prove that it's superior to 797. And it also applies to everything, not just IVs, but any type of compounding that you're going to apply, implant, inject, insert into the body. Just a picture of a clean room. If you haven't seen one, remember the IV picture I showed you that we learned none of those you can do anymore. You have to have the gowning area, the ISA 7 room. All of that has to be laid out and very specific in terms of the clean room capacity. And there's a lot of companies that have made a lot of money in terms of coming in and designing 797 compliant compounding areas. I want to go over different use categories for 797. There are immediate use, which we're going to talk about, and then we'll talk about other types of use. But the first one is immediate use. This is not in Colorado rules, and the reason why is because it's immediate use. They didn't contemplate it. It's not for pharmacy to compound and have available sitting in the nursing unit. So a typical scenario would be like an emergency room. So you need to give somebody an IV immediately. You don't send the order to the pharmacy, have pharmacy compounding, and sending it back to the emergency department. It's meant for immediate use, so it's just what it says. There's no delays or interruptions from when you would administer this. It is simple transfer, and it's not more than, NMT is not more than 3 non-hazardous. So the differentiator here is you're not talking about chemo, right? So you're not going to give somebody immediate chemo that would be hazardous to make in an emergency department setting. And there's no expected contamination of ingredients. It's not going to sit around and grow bacteria. This is immediate use. I gave those examples. It's not intended to be a loophole. This is really, truly when somebody needs it right away. Next risk level is low risk. So ISO 5 is essentially looking at the number of particles in the air, and that's defined there. I would tell my students I don't necessarily need you to memorize it, just understand that. And essentially what you're doing is simple aseptic transfer of not more than 3 products. And I realize we're going through this really fast because we have 4 of us, which is great because you won't get bored listening to one of us for 2 hours, but we all tend to be wordy, so I'm going through through this pretty quickly. Medium risk, same as low risk, but it's more than 3 products, so essentially what can you think of that falls in that category? TPN. I mean, that's probably the easiest example. And it's more complex in terms of the preparation. And then high risk. The easiest way to think about high risk is making something that's non-sterile into sterile. So like a bulk powder that you're going to go through a terminal sterilization, and that is going to be administered to the patient. I'll quiz you on this. Really, no, I'm kidding. What you need to know is beyond use state. So based on risk level and storage temperature, there's different beyond use states that are defined as, again, minimum standards. So you can see a low risk controlled room temperature is 48 hours. And this is just beyond use dating for storage. If there's other specific manufacturer instructions, those supersede this, but this is beyond use dating for storage conditions. Remember I talked about garbing requirements and whose hands or whose office is dirtier. This is where that comes in. So whether or not you can use makeup or jewelry, so women that like to have makeup and jewelry, you're probably not best served by going to a compounding pharmacy because you will not have to be able to wear any makeup or jewelry in any of those risk categories. Hand washing is the one that applies to everything. Hair and facial covers apply again. Shoe covers, the gowns apply, sterile gloves and masks. So remember that guy sitting in the IV hood? You would never see that today. Or you better not see it today. At least when Janine comes to visit your pharmacy, you might not be too happy. All right. Just the order in terms of personnel cleansing and garbing, there is a very specific order in which you must do it. And I'm not going to go into detail. You have these handouts if you want to wear them, but just know that you go essentially from dirtiest area to cleanest. So you remove your garments, you garb, you dump first of all your shoe covers, as you might expect, then hair, and then the hygiene in the gown. Again, once you're inside the clean area, then you're going to cleanse your hands with alcohol, surgical hand scrub. Then you do gloves on top of that, and you're repeatedly applying sterile alcohol to the gloves between every preparation. So even though we had all this in place, I wanted to kind of highlight what happened with the New England Compounding Center. And I know you've all heard of this probably to some degree, but that really got everyone's attention and fast forwarded us to where we are today. This was October of 2012, and you might be aware of the fact that they unfortunately chose to compound in a non-sterile environment, and there was fungal meningitis, which contaminated methylprednisolone acetate suspension, which was shipped widely across the United States. Luckily, our state board, you may, sometimes like, I got to get those CE hours, but they did a huge service for all of us and the citizens of Colorado. And really, Wendy Anderson, who is the headed up the state board at that time, our faculty awarded her the Distinguished Coloradan Award this past week at our graduation ceremonies because really she was responsible to a huge degree to keeping those products out of our state. But you can see the number and thousands of doses that were shipped, that 14,000 patients were exposed to it. And just look at the number of deaths, anywhere from 48 to 64 deaths. and the number of lawsuits that were pending. So, even though we probably didn't see it, we didn't see it in our state, the impact on this across the U.S. was startling. Just to give you an idea, this is what you're dealing with. The middle picture, that's actually a test media in which they took a sample of the methylprednisolone, and you can see the fungus growing on top of it. I mean, that's what was injected in people's spinal cords. And there's the product. These are pictures of two of the pharmacists that work there that were recently arrested, and Mike will go into this in more detail, for really malicious intent. And frankly, you hate to hear of pharmacists, our colleagues that have bad things happen to them, but these people were intentionally doing a lot of bad things. This is on the bottom corner. This was just to give you an idea of a house one of them lived in. Doesn't look like my house in Highlands Ranch, I can tell you that. But just, greed, unfortunately, was quite powerful, and a lot of what happened today is because of the tragedy that occurred. So because of that, the government, oh gosh, I got to go fast. All right. Because of that, the government stepped in and, essentially appointed a subcommittee of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, 48 compounding centers. So New England Compounding Center was the tip of the iceberg, but 48 other companies were found to be producing and selling drugs that were contaminated. I would ask you how fast bacteria multiply, but that's what we're really getting at, is the fact that if you're not compounding in a sterile environment and you introduce just a few bacteria, bad things happen, that exponential growth occurs. So just in case you're wondering what happened, it wasn't the fact you're getting ready for Thanksgiving dinner, although it was the day before Thanksgiving, but President Obama did sign into law the Compounding Quality Act. That occurred a little less than 2 years ago now, that you really got the attention of Congress, that really looked at the fact that people were making money and not protecting the public. A comment from Harry Reid, people were in fact risking lives. So this Drug Quality and Security Act, it created a new section under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. What it did is the compounders can become an outsourcing facility that qualifies for exemptions from the FDA, but they are not exempted from current good manufacturing processes. So they essentially have to follow good manufacturing processes. It superseded a bunch of other laws, but the bottom line is it enabled the FDA to ID providers, products, and actually be more systematic in terms of getting reports and inspecting places for good manufacturing practices. Here's the downside. It is voluntary. There are some downsides. I'll mention that. I want to move on quickly to the Colorado pharmacy rules. Non-sterile compounding, quickly. What if you have a prescription for this and have the following ingredients on hand and you plan to make 120 mLs, what expiration date would you put on the product? 8/15. Yep, right. So normally you could put 90 days, but if you have an ingredient that expires sooner, that's what you put. All right, another question for you. If you become the manager at a local retail pharmacy, which of the following is true? Actually, number one. Number two is you have to do that every 1 year. And then third point is you need to update and sign it within 30 days. So all retail establishments, regardless of whether you're doing sterile compounding, you must also have a non-sterile compounding manual. You do have to maintain compounding records. A compounding record is different from formulation. A formulation is just a recipe card. Compounding records must be kept on site for 3 years. That's true. Or actually 2 years. And then compounding record must, so number 3 is correct. Quickly on drug take back. I'm getting the evil number 1. All right. I'm just going to ask you real quick. Anybody do take back programs? Okay. You know the reasons why we're doing them. Lots of prescription drugs, people taking more drugs. This is like pediatric poisonings. You can see on the top there, analgesics rise to the top, all sorts of things laying around in people's medicine cabinets. All right, here's my question for you guys. Where do the majority of individuals with a history of substance abuse obtain pain medications? B? Prescriber? Who says prescriber? Who says B? Who says C? Okay, you're right. This is really interesting. Sources of pain meds. 55% of people, even though we are the gatekeepers, 55% will get them from families and friends. That doesn't count the ones that they're like taking from the friend and relatives medicine cabinet. This is just like, I'm sorry you have pain. Here, take this. All right. Water supply contamination. The DEA does have control, and they oversee drug take-back. There was a Drug Disposal Act of 2010. Essentially, there's 3 options, and I'm going to finish really fast. Take-back programs, mail-back programs, and collection receptacles. The collection receptacles are the regulations are quite onerous, so most people have not done it. You can do it and charge people, but those are the rules that the DEA came up with. These are the people who can be collectors. The DEA is no longer doing take-back programs. Remember the ones they did twice a year? They are no longer doing those because they feel that they have created rules to enable others to serve as collectors. Here's the mail-back programs. Here's all the requirements if you're going to have a collection receptacle. Again, a lot of record keeping. You have to do special procedures to remove the inner liner. And I'm going to turn it over to Mike. One good news, though, is that today, as you might know, the Supreme Court, the County of Alameda, which is Oakland, California, they passed legislation about manufacturers having to pay for the drug take-back programs. It went up to the Supreme Court because pharma fought that, and the Supreme Court ruled in the favor of pharma companies having to support those take-back programs. Now, whether or not they'll pass the costs on, which they probably will indirectly, but at least it's going to help us because these are onerous and very costly. And if you can imagine, a lot of pharmacies that are already strapped with resources, it's very tough to do these. But hopefully that will help. And I'm going to turn it back to Mike.